Hi, good afternoon. You're all very welcome to our webinar today on how to carry out a double materiality assessment. So just to note that today's webinar is being recorded and we will share the slides and the recording afterwards. If you have any questions at any stage during the webinar, please feel free just to pop them into the chat and hopefully we'll be able to address them at the end. So my name is Kathleen O'Regan. I'm a senior executive in the Sustainability and Renewable Energy Department of Enterprise Ireland. We are hosting today's webinar in collaboration with Centigo on how to carry out a double materiality assessment. This is the last webinar in our series this year, but we do plan to host more webinars next year. So this webinar is focused on how to carry out a double materiality assessment, which is the process to identify and prioritise environmental, social and governance issues that are most relevant and significant to an organisation and their shareholders. And it must be carried out by companies that are in scope of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Today's webinar will provide insights to companies on how to conduct a double materiality assessment. And it will also be of interest to companies that are voluntarily reporting on their sustainability in terms of their sustainability report, but also on how to develop their sustainability strategy. Because the CSRD standards and the EFRAG guidance are seen as best practice globally, I suppose, for prioritising sustainability issues and for sustainability reporting. So we are joined today by an expert panel, which will be led by Dr. Ray Nolte, who is Managing Partner of Centigo UK and Ireland. Ray is an experienced management consultant with over 35 years experience and is currently serving as the Managing Partner UK and Ireland for Centigo, which is a Swedish-based management consulting firm with a strong track record in helping clients tackle strategic and transformation challenges and sustainability across various industries. Ray is going to be joined by Nick Gowing, who is former BBC journalist and author of Thinking the Unthinkable. Gabriel Darcy, who is former CEO of Bord na Móna, Lakeland Dairies and head of Europe Curry Group PLC. Martin Massey, who is Cambridge University and chair of climate risk at the Institute of Risk Management. And finally, Francisco Granja, who is an ESG technology expert from Portugal. So Ray, I'll hand over to you and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and I look forward to the next hour and we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I hope you can all see my slides. Yep. So I'm going to kick off with describing what double materiality is and then we're going to go through the how-to process. Now, for those people who are interested in taking notes, we actually have produced a 20-page guide to accompany this presentation. So if you're looking for a lot more detail than we're going to give during the process today, please request the document from Enterprise Ireland. So the first thing I'd say is that double materiality is a fundamental requirement of CSRD, and it's probably one of the first things that we undertake when we're actually undertaking a project. And indeed, before we actually undertake a ESG strategy for an organization, typically we will do double materiality to a level of detail, which actually helps us to understand the implications of sustainability on the organization's strategy and business model. Double materiality has been around for a while, but it's somewhat different with CSRD. And really, we've been asked, what we're asking here from a double materiality point of view is to identify those issues which are most significant and relevant to an organization and its stakeholder. And materiality itself relates to all those things that are really important to the organization: its profitability, the growth of its customers, regulatory compliance, etc. But there are two key elements to double materiality. The first one is the impact the organization has on the environment and society. And the second one is the external impacts and how they will impact the organization itself and what are the material financial issues that affect organization performance and long-term value creation. Now, Gabriel Darcy, who Kathleen mentioned as former CEO of Bord na Móna, Gabriel was doing sustainability before a lot of organizations were actually considering it. And Gabriel was the guy who chief executive rather, who oversaw the transition from Bord being one of Ireland's dirtiest companies to a very profitable, innovative, clean green energy organization. And Gabriel, my understanding is that you followed a process of almost a double materiality process, but it wasn't called double materiality then. You were looking at triple bottom line. So how did you actually look at the outside in and inside out impacts of sustainability back in your Bord days?
Thanks, Ray, and good afternoon, all. Double materiality as a concept had not been formalized, let's say, as it is today in the context of corporate sustainability reporting. However, on assuming the position of MD of Bord I had read my way into the position. I had to understand about carbon cycles, I had to understand about water cycle, about greenhouse gas emissions. I also had to understand about biodiversity. I had to understand about supply chains. I had to understand about carbon sinks. So when I arrived in Bord for sure, you're right, it was, in today's terms, it would be arguably the dirtiest company in the country on any metric, per unit of turnover, per employee, and so forth. The triple bottom line approach, in my mind, was critical in trying to change the focus of the company. Triple bottom line reporting then was optional. It wasn't mandatory like CSRD is today. And CSRD and double materiality, while it's mandatory for the larger companies, it is highly recommended and advised. In fact, EFRAG have advised smaller and micro companies to embrace this, because your customers are going to be looking for this. So it wasn't mandatory, Ray, or at the time it was optional. We were understanding at this stage the value of carbon, and carbon in bogs was actually better, more valuable to society to keep them there than taken out the peat. There was also the bogs were outstanding biodiversity reservoirs, and we were emitting huge quantities of greenhouse gas emissions in all our operations. At the time, 95% of Bord turnover was peat related. So it was very, very clear that this was material. This was a very material issue for Bord and regulations were on the horizon. And in fact, if you weren't sympathetic to why this is important, biodiversity loss and carbon emissions, well, then you're going to struggle. It forced us, Ray, into looking at our business model, and it forced us into looking at a new business model on a new vision. And that was a contract with nature. It was a shared vision. A lot of people participated in it. And then we started doing detailed materiality assessments. For instance, with the Carbon Disclosure Project, we brought them in to look at and measure exactly what our emissions were and the damage we were doing to the environment. A lot of people criticized me and us for, in inverted commas, washing our dirty linen in public. But that was our first tentative steps. We launched a sustainability report in 2008, 2009. I think we were the first large company to do so. There was 46 pages in that document. The following year, it was 97 pages. We got better and more detailed. And we were looking at people and our workers, our employees. We hadn't looked at workers in a value chain. We were looking at our profits, because we have to be sustainable from a profitability point of view as we're doing this. But we also looked at it from a planet point of view. So that was our first start, if you like, into what today would be called a double materiality, because obviously there was a lot of impacts now falling on Bord from the outside, from the changing environment, as well as what we were putting into the environment in terms of emissions, with huge financial implications.
Thank you. Martin Massey. Martin is a renowned lecturer in ESG, and he's written a book on ESG risk management. You're on mute, Martin. I wonder if you could come off mute. I want to ask you a question. The CSRD, EFRAG are very specific that we need to take a structured approach when we're looking at double materiality. And it involves looking at the scope and context and identify of the assessment, but also identifying potential impacts, risks, and opportunities along the entire organization value chain, and evaluating materiality along the value chain from both an impact materiality and a financial materiality perspective. Is this any different to good management practice, good risk management, or is there something different in this?
Yeah, good afternoon, Ray, and welcome everybody. Yeah, just so it's a very good question. I mean, I've been a chief risk officer for over 10 years, working in the financial services sector, and that led me to getting involved in climate change and ESG. As you mentioned, I now teach ESG risk management for executives at Cambridge. Interestingly, we use some of the traditional risk management processes, identification, assessment, risk treatment, reporting, and monitoring. And I think you look into CSRD and the processes and the methodologies, there's a lot of commonality, but there obviously are some differences as well, which obviously we want to convey here. But ultimately, as you pointed out, the main sort of importance of benefits are to actually get companies to promote sustainability in their organizations. From a strategic point of view, prioritize sustainability efforts to allocate resources effectively. But from a risk management point of view, which is sort of my main area of focus, is really very similar. It's identifying material issues, better manage potential risks and opportunities. And I think opportunities is one of the critical areas that I've seen fundamentally change in the area of enterprise risk management, but it's the alignment with strategy I think is very important. And I think as you go on and talk through the presentation, a lot of focus on stakeholder engagement and management, and looking at external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, doing external stakeholder mapping, prioritizing the importance. So I think that is a critical. So these are risk management, traditional risk management tools, but they've not necessarily been used very effectively by organizations. Horizon scanning, looking at emerging risks, threats, and opportunities as well, which is a key part. So it's what are the tools that underpin this? What can companies use to actually build out their double materiality? And a lot of it's around, what are the best approaches to do this? As you know, as we'll come on to, a whole range of issues around data collection. But one of the pros, the alignment, which I'm happy to talk a bit more on, is risk appetite, strategy, and alignment there because of the setting the thresholds. More than happy to go into that in a bit more detail as we go through the presentation.
Thanks, Martin. And Francisco, you're working this area quite a lot, and I don't know if your experience is the same as mine. Very often when we've reviewed the double materiality assessments that organizations have done, they have taken into account, yes, stakeholders, but they haven't actually consulted with the stakeholders. That's almost kind of a finger in the air approach in terms of what do we think they need, or what do we think is important to them? But also, very importantly, this value chain element as well. And the correct way to do it is to actually look at stakeholders within the value chain and the intersection between them and material risks. What's your experience in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Ray, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, stakeholders engagement is key. You cannot do this without stakeholder engagement, and I think the law is very clear about that in every step of the way. As you know, the CSRD is a typical law, contrary to other pieces of legislation of the European Green Deal. The CSRD, it's not one directive; it revokes two other directives, so it's a bit tricky to read it as a whole. But we see the legal references to mandatory stakeholder engagement, particularly when it comes to labor, internal labor organizations, workers' organizations within the company. So I would risk to say that without stakeholder engagement, effective stakeholder engagement per se, particularly when it comes to workers of the company, the double materiality, it's not well done. And what I've seen here in Portugal happening a bit is that companies that already have a strong due diligence mechanism in place flow very easily into stakeholder engagement, naturally, because if you have a strong due diligence mechanism in place in your company when it comes to human rights and environmental issues, and just in brackets, I come from a business and human rights field. I'm a lawyer that works in business and human rights, and then I developed into double materiality as well. For those companies that already ongoing procedures to stakeholder engagement, to their workers, to the workers on the value chain, to their communities, they will be on a better position to answer to double materiality. So that's a key point that I would stress as well. But yeah, I completely agree with you. Stakeholder engagement is full of particular dynamics, and it's full of how to say, details on how to do it. It's not easy to do stakeholder engagement. There's specific ways to do it. And I think sometimes stakeholder engagement goes by just the easy part of stakeholder engagement. So when they pick and choose the stakeholders they want to engage with, but in fact, I think that the law prescribes at least for 2 specific stakeholders to be consulted, and those are the effective victims, potential effective victims, and the workers. So to conclude, absolutely right, it is key. And I think that sometimes there is a bit of a pick and choose when it comes to stakeholder engagement, when there are 2 that can never, in my opinion, be oversight, which are the workers and the potential affected communities.
Thank you, Francisco. It's interesting for those of you who have read the statutory instrument for CSRD in Ireland, that the Irish government, I think, is the only government that I know of has actually mandated employees to be consulted in fair detail about this area. So that backs up what Francisco has said. It's interesting also, just before this webinar, I got an email from one of our clients, a major state company, and they said that, can we provide them with their auditors with the methodology and the approach that we're actually using to conduct double materiality for them? So the evidence and the proof that you're doing it in a structured way is very critical. It's a very critical process. What I've done here is I've just thrown some, apologies, very detailed slides in here, but these are, I thought it'd be useful just to show a few slides. And this is from the payment sector, and it discusses, and we do a lot of work, particularly in Sweden and in Germany with payment organizations. And this has been prepared for an international, a US payments organization who are about to start preparing their CSRD, or preparing for CSRD reporting. And it's a very good example of some of the things that you need to consider when undertaking double materiality. So the first point is that you can see here that internal and external stakeholders are critical to identify impacts, risks, and opportunities. And you can see here on the left-hand side, the companies that we've dealt with, the payment companies, the level of engagement that they've undertaken with particular categories of stakeholders. So you can see a huge engagement with clients, suppliers, regulators, investors, NGOs, and then some of their partners and rating agencies, still a lot, and then the media, not a lot. But it kind of gives you an idea of what some very large organizations are actually doing. Now, when they're actually engaging with these organizations, as I said earlier, they are looking at these, they actually segment the entire value chain, downstream, upstream, internal, and they actually look at each of these stakeholders in quite a lot of detail. And how do they do that? They conduct workshops, they conduct interviews and surveys. EFRAG have recently indicated that they're not that keen on surveys. We're not particularly keen on surveys ourselves either. And in fact, we do have some doubts about interviews and sometimes workshops, but certainly their preference is workshops and interviews. And we found ourselves using neuroscience because we're concerned that when we are actually surveying these stakeholders or interacting with them, that there's bias. And what we're trying to do is we use neuroscience to try and eliminate the unconscious bias that's there and actually get to the truth. The other thing I would say is that when we do a word cloud based on the key issues that the stakeholders are really focused on and that come up as material issues for these organizations are things like risk, as Martin mentioned, sustainability, investor relations, the strategy, diversity, inclusion, and HR. I'm not saying that these are all right, but these are the sort of issues that have come up in that industry. And some of the highlights that have come out through this work that we've done, that a key challenge facing, I think, all organizations is how to define your value chain, including its start and end points. So the scoping is really quite important for undertaking DMAs, double materiality assessments. It's also noticeable that quite a few companies are now starting to publish their double materiality assessments, big glossy reports associated with it, which actually support their strategy documents. And what we're seeing is that the strategy documents themselves are now being very influenced by, and I'm not talking about ESG strategies, I'm talking about their corporate strategies, by double materiality assessments. I think the other thing here is that we used to see double materiality assessments being influenced greatly by the UN Sustainable Development Goals and people using those to help identify material issues. But we're seeing now under ESRS that organizations are beginning to look at it using the ESRS topics. And this is just a view from the payment organizations that we've worked at, which are the mandatory ones like ESRS 1 and ESRS 2, the general requirements and general disclosures. And then always material, 100% material are climate change, own workforce. And then frequently material, you can see things like pollution, water and marine resources, biodiversity, ecosystems, etc. So it just gives you an idea of what some organizations have done. Now, my problem with this is that when you actually go down into this in more detail, what you find is that there's very few of the ESRSs which don't have an impact, and indeed don't have a material impact on organizations. And so it's a matter of relative degree of importance that they have. This is just brings us down further into the environmental ones. And what we've seen to date is that there's been a huge focus on climate change and to a lesser extent pollution. And now what we're seeing is that biodiversity, water ecosystem, soil, air, and a range of other, the full range of environmental issues are really important for organizations. But I think, this GHGs are still going to be really, greenhouse gases are still going to be very important. But we really find that organizations are now having to actually expand on what they thought was important for this. And then from a social and a governance point of view, I think the concept of the entire value chain has cut a lot of organizations out. I mean, most of our clients do a really good job on their own workforce, and it's always material, obviously, for them. But we are finding areas that, workers in the value chain, affected communities are becoming a lot more important for organizations. I mean, an example here is that the payment companies generally didn't think that affected communities were a big issue for them. But we know we've worked with payments companies, for example, in the States, and there's been well-published views that, certain ethnic communities have been biased, for example, in the services that they're getting from these types of organizations. So I'd just like to throw out a question to panelists. Should you use ESRS or should you use the UN SDGs to help you determine materiality, or should you be using another mechanism? Francesco?
I have no questions regarding that. You should use the ESRS. If I understood the question, is if we use the ESRS or the SDGs? Yeah, no, there's no question about that. We should definitely use the ESRS first, and then if we need extra criteria and if we need other exploration beyond that, we should go to other standards. There's a particular phase in the double materiality process that we will get to it, which is the identification of sustainability topics. And the law is very clear that you should use the ESRS, particularly the RA16, to take a look at sustainability topics that might be considered material to your organization. And then you should take a look at other standards, like for example, the SDGs are not mentioned, but GRI, for example. So I would have no bigger questions that you should definitely start with the ESRS first. And then if you want to use the SDGs and their metrics to complement the ESRS, I think that's not a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible to align and map them to each other, but I think when you're actually looking at ESRS, it's a lot more specific and it's a lot more helpful. The SDGs the targets only last up to 2030, whereas the time frame for ESRS is much longer. And what we've seen is organizations start off with SDGs in terms of actually defining what they're going to do in terms of a materiality, and then they're reporting on ESRS, which doesn't make sense. So you're better off aligning with this and that everything is consistent with this, particularly if you have to have this audited and you have to have in fact, it's a much more comprehensive approach. Martin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree in terms of the context of carrying out this exercise. But I've been involved when, for example, designing. And your link here is looking at the difference between external and internal reporting. So I've been designing KRI dashboards across ESG for companies. And what's interesting, I'm trying to focus more on the alignment between existing taxonomies and risk registers. And there is a misalignment, slight misalignment, but obviously we go to more granularity in terms of maybe descriptions. But there is a commonality. But I do think it's being aware of the fact that if you're looking at integration as well, and alignment in the organisation, you need to think maybe broadly. So SDGs are a good source. MSCI, sort of the ESG issues themed. For our Cambridge course, I went back to the drawing board and actually designed a set of risk across ESG, social and governance factors. They're very similar, but I think it's being aware of nuances and differences. And obviously, as we've discussed, differences in relation to the organization's risk profile and relevance as well. There may be things that are missing, but generally it's quite broad. So it should cover most of the broad topics. I think the difference here has been topics and risks. Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. I think one tip to remember is that when you are doing this, remember that the FRAG have not issued industry-specific guidelines yet, and that if something is a material risk for you and it isn't caught up in some of the holistic measures and topics that are here within ESRS, you should also include them. So don't necessarily follow them slavishly. There are some big issues and some big challenges that are out there which are going to cause issues to clients that need to be addressed. You can't assume everything is covered by it. It's certainly guideline. They're guidelines. So to conduct a double materiality assessment, CSRD, for CSRD compliance, you need to follow a structured process. And this typically involves identifying business activities, including those in the value chain, determining the potential impacts, risks, and opportunities. We call these IROs. And then organizations must then assess the materiality of these IROs from both an impact and a financial perspective. And this diagram shows the 5 broad steps which we recommend, probably very similar to other steps. But when you are evaluating the impact materiality, you should consider factors such as the scale of the impact, how intense the effects are, the scope, how widespread the impacts are, and the irremediable character, how difficult it would be to remediate any of the damage. So for financial materiality, considerations include the likelihood of the risk or the opportunity materializing and the magnitude of potential financial risk itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these 5 steps and discuss them in turn. So the first one is defining the scope and the context. And really what we're saying here is that there's a number of things that you need to do. The first one is to conduct a comprehensive analysis of your business activities, your business model, your relationships, and your value chain. The second one is to define the broad boundaries and scope of the assessment that you're undertaking. And the third one is to identify key stakeholders and how they're going to be engaged. And I like to think of the scope of a double materiality assessment as a matrix. Down one side you have the ESRS topics and subtopics and subtopics. And then across the top, you have the value chain, you have the stakeholders for each element of the value chain, and you measure them from how critical or how important they are. And then within the cells, the intersecting part, you basically look at what are the risks, what are the opportunities, what are the negative, and what are the positive impacts associated with that. Now, you can jump down to a very low level of detail here. And what we certainly recommend for an organization to do is keep it initially up at a high level, just to understand really the context of this and the depth that you need to go to. And it still is quite an extensive analysis to do that. But what we also do is, as you build up that high level matrix, you also should be identifying what are the implications on the business model, what are the implications on the organization strategy, and what are the risks associated with at an overall risk management level. And I think that gives you a very good framework. Where you need to drill down into more detail for issues which are specific to your own organization, let's say you're a port or you're a fishing organization, you need to go down to the marine side, whereas it may not be a material issue or indeed a relevant issue for you if you are another type of organization. So that's the key area in terms of defining scope. And just as a kind of a view of some of the things that you're kind of using as inputs to this are your business plan, mentioned your strategy, your business model, your financial statements, your activities. You need to consider it from a product or service point of view. And you also need to understand it from your geographic location perspective, your company policy perspective. You need to gather those because policies typically need to be revised as a result of that. You may need additional policies. The risks and the impacts of different locations and for different businesses and for different products are very different. So you're actually building up information from a fairly low level when you're actually trying to assess the materiality of these to the organization itself. And really what you want to come out of this is an understanding of the context for the organization. It helps you to identify your IROs, and it also helps you to target key stakeholders to be involved within that process. Now, just throwing this out to Gabriel. Gabriel, you've been involved in these types of exercises, and what are the challenges do you see in trying to start off a double materiality assessment in terms of engaging the organization and getting them to consider it as a major issue which impacts all areas of the business model?
Yeah, indeed, Ray. Look, there's a lot of different angles onto this. One thing that I will say, irrespective of what size your business is, going through this, even the slide that you have, where you have to define, you have to think about, well, what is my business plan? What is my strategy? What is my business model? For a lot of companies, they haven't actually looked at the critical parts of their business model. You know, who their key partners are, who are their key customers and the sectors, what's their cost base, what are the key activities, and in the middle that connects what's their value proposition. So there's a lot of benefit in doing good business benefit in doing this and going through this process. And the double materiality, as you say, is a defined process. The other thing that I would say is EFRAG have published guidelines on voluntary ESRSs for non-listed small and medium-sized enterprises, the VSMEs ESRSs. And actually, they've defined like what they would describe as a micro company will be about 700,000 maximum, 700,000 euros in net turnover, up to 10 employees. A small company with a balance sheet of 4 million, a maximum of 8 million turnover, 50 employees. A medium size, 20 million balance sheet, 40 million in net turnover, 250 employees. So obviously, the size and the scale of the enterprise has a bearing on what resources you have available to do this type of work. But assuming that it's captured in your business plan and your strategy, and where sustainability, like what ultimately is driving all of this, what's driving this is we're heading to 3 degrees above industrial levels, edge of extinction, extreme massive weather events, and all the rest of it. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing it because it's just for the purpose of getting more data and more oversight by authorities. We're doing it because we're heading into a real crisis. And in that context, it's critical that companies, whether you're micro, small, or medium, embrace this. You might not be mandated to do it, but there's good business disciplines to be got out of it, as well as linking in your ESG strategy, your sustainability strategy into that corporate strategy, because you cannot have a corporate strategy that in some way or other is inconsistent with your ESG strategy. Otherwise, it invites the opportunity of greenwashing and so forth.
Thank you. Francisco, in terms of stakeholder engagement, is it too early to involve any stakeholders during this step?
Not at all, not at all. Because if during this step we're trying to, I think of all the steps, this is the one where stakeholder engagement is not as critical as all the other ones. So let's see, in all the other steps, stakeholder engagement is absolutely critical. In this step particularly, well, I don't think it's too early, because let's face it, in this step, we should start identifying our context and the business operations and the business model and the strategy, and often to identify all these key characteristics of the company. External and internal stakeholders are needed. Their voices are needed to be heard. So I would say it's definitely not too early, but in taking in mind that this is a burdensome process for the companies, and it's not easy to do in real life. If I had to say, okay, there's a stage where stakeholder engagement is critical, I would not put that pressure in this stage, because at this stage we're still doing kind of a photograph of the company. Like, we're taking a picture of who we are as a company, where are we going, who our key stakeholders are. And a good company, like Gabriel was saying, a company that already has that knowledge might do this step quite easily. This might be an easy step to do. So if I had to put pressure in stakeholder engagement in one of the steps of the process, it would not be this one. Although, of course, I think in this step, they're more than welcome to give input.
Yeah, I think all the, you can say for anything, the answer, it depends. And I guess, it depends on the maturity of the organization. And typically we find that at this stage, if the entire organization, particularly internal stakeholders, haven't been engaged in this, and we need to ramp them up, and we need them to understand the scope and the issues associated with it, and the level of activity that's required, it's probably a good place to involve them. And then you can also, particularly if you're, if you're really dependent on key partners, it might be the right time to involve them and understanding what they're doing. But yeah, typically it's the scoping, it's the photograph side, but there are reasons to involve people at this stage. Now, moving on to the second stage, this is actually developing the IROs, and typically what we do is we create a long list of all the areas that need assessment using the SRS topics and subtopics that we mentioned earlier. We engage stakeholders in the process, trying to get their input and their views on this, and we use their input to help agree potential impacts, negative and positive impacts. Like a lot of organizations are doing a lot of good things, and indeed they should be recorded and they need to be reported on. And I think also as part of this really helps, kind of builds on the scoping exercise and helps you to understand if the topics are relevant, and you're beginning to get a view of the areas that you need to report on from a materiality perspective. And then you may also need to use some other tools such as life cycle analysis assessment or environmental spend analysis to support this process. Nick Gowing, I mean, this is an area where, you know, your expertise excels, and what you're doing, what you often do is you work with organizations and particularly stakeholders to bring a vast group of stakeholders together to come to consensus and agreement on what the key challenges and risks and issues are. You know, what do you believe are the most successful things that you need to achieve in order to get the full input and build consensus in stakeholder engagement, particularly given that, you know, not all stakeholders will have the same level of interests, they won't think the same way, and you're going to get a conflicting set of requirements.
Thank you, Ray. I hope you can hear me. I'm in a public space actually in London at the moment, so apologies that I can't use my video at the moment. But I think one of the critical things which I wanted to say, particularly after what Gabriel said, is that this is about not being overwhelmed or intimidated by the enormity of what this sounds like. It's about accepting that this is a new reality. It's a new reality of the way society is going. And even if there's a lot of jargon and a lot of abbreviations and so on, it's important to grip the enormity of the principles, quite apart from the process as well. I know people who really feel quite overwhelmed by all of this, feeling of we can leave it for another day. We can hope it'll go away. It isn't like that at all. And so the fact that you've got 75 people on this webinar listening to it, wanting to embrace this, is an important step in a process of creating what I call mind muscle, creating a new willingness and ability and a strength of mind to be able to cope with this. And it is about coping with it because it is about change, and it's about change at a significant pace. Because what is happening and what Gabriel described and what we all know about, whether it's 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or 1 degree, or 1.5 degrees, it's all moving very quickly, and the science is moving in a rather sinister direction. So my answer to you, Ray, is simply that those that I've seen who've really embraced it and made it feel not like a burden, but actually a real business challenge, are really rising to that challenge and doing it very successfully and creating a new culture at every level within an organization, however big or small it is. Great.
Thank you very much. And this is just a kind of a high-level view of the sort of matrix that you build when you're beginning to look at double materiality. So you can see the SRS topics here on the left-hand side. We haven't got them all indicated, and you can see where we show, you know, you need to look at upstream, own operations, and downstream. But this is obviously, there's a lot more columns here, and you begin to look at the negative impacts, the positive impacts, and you need to look at the risks and opportunities associated with particularly the financial elements of this. And, you know, we would see you producing something like this as part of this process. And then from a stakeholder engagement point of view, you need to think about, well, who are the stakeholders? You need to map them in terms of, are they affected by the company's operations, or do they affect the company's operations? You need to take into account internal, external stakeholders, and you need to think about the appropriate engagement methods, and we've spoken about those earlier. So step 3 is really where you're beginning to identify materiality from an impact perspective. And really what you need to do is you need to consider both actual and potential impacts, as well as the positive and negative impacts across the entire value chain. And then you need to identify the material impacts using agreed thresholds. And then you need to quantify the material impacts by engaging with stakeholders, NGOs, and experts. And effectively, we build up something like this matrix that we have here. We're looking at scale, we're looking at scope, we're looking at the irremediable character, we're looking at the likelihood and magnitude. And this scale here is just, or this diagram here just helps you to focus the question. So really, when you're looking at actual negative impacts, it's about scale, scope, and irremediable character. But when you're looking at risks, you're looking at likelihood and magnitude, as the same for opportunities. Martin, you mentioned thresholds earlier as part of this process. Would you like to elaborate on them?
Yeah, I think it's one of the key challenges. There are different types of thresholds used in organizations, and I think it's important to engage with different stakeholders, you know, working with finance, with compliance, and with risk to get a better understanding. It's actually a little bit what Nick was saying, it's almost an opportunity to go back to the drawing board and think about your, linked to your risk appetite strategy, the threshold you're setting for managing risks, and in this case, opportunities as well. And in my experience, I've been sort of helping companies look at their existing risk assessment criteria, and using that as a way of redesigning it a little bit for this type of exercise. What I do find interesting is the difference between, if you like, the risk management world, where we effectively have these scales of 1 to 5, which is similar, but here it's very much binary. It's a material or not material. I think that's a challenge, but I think it's also important to really understand how you decide those thresholds. So looking at existing criteria, particularly around the financial impacts and likelihood of occurrence, and thinking through how do you actually design those thresholds, so, and align it to your risk appetite strategy. So I think there's definitely an opportunity here to think a bit more strategically around how you define materiality in the organization as a whole. And obviously it will vary depending on the size of the organization, the legal entity you're looking at, etc. There's a lot of factors involved in here in getting this right, because it's a danger in a way that you might miss out or consider issues or topics that aren't material when in fact they are. And so getting that process right is important. But yeah, there's a lot more science to this than meets the eye.
Yeah. So for example, when you're looking at scale, I mean, this is about the intensity of the negative or positive impacts on individuals or on the environment. And what you're looking at is a scale which looks at substantial, probably major, moderate, or minimal. And you can score those on a scale of 1 to 5, depending on the categories you're using. When you're looking at the scope, it's the breadth of the negative or positive impacts. So it could be high, moderate, medium, moderate, or low. The irremediable character, that's the difficulty of remediating or reversing any actual damage. So it could be impossible, it could be challenging, moderately difficult, or easy. Likelihood is the probability of the potential impact occurring, or the risk or the opportunity materializing. So it could be almost certain, likely, possible, unlikely, or the magnitude. And that's the significance of the financial implications of the risk or opportunity were to materialize. And that would be above or below specific thresholds. So you do really need a scoring mechanism, sort of a scientific approach which supports you in doing this. And here's some of the ways that we have used to score some of these. So if you look at the negative environmental, if you look at the negative environmental scale on severity, we say you add the 3 columns here, A, B, C, and divided by 3, and you use a scoring point. So for example, 5 is very high, worst it has been in years. Then you look at how widespread is the impact on the environment, global or total, and the irremediality C, irremediable or irreversible. So you're using a score of 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 on this. And similarly, when you're looking at the positive environmental severity, a similar process. Negative social score severity, again, a very similar process. And then for materiality, that really depends on the organization itself in terms of its threshold. And you're coming up again with a scoring mechanism. This is one that we've used for a particular client. We're using EBITDA investments. If the impact is above 5 million, it's 3 impact points. If it's between 2.5 and 5 million, it's 2, and below 2.51. And then we also take a long-term perspective in terms of EBITDA investment using the thresholds that are indicated here. So the scoring mechanisms are really quite important. So step 4 is to look at materiality from a financial perspective. Now, this is really quite important because here, and although you are looking at it within the impact assessment, effectively what you're looking at is the outside-in implications here. And what really you need to do is you need to be able to run scenario analysis on this. So what are the implications of the various risk factors, whether it's climate, health, social, whatever, and their interconnection with each other, and the implications on the organization. And that's and specifically ESRS requires you do this against this strategy and business model, as Gabriel and Francisco has indicated earlier. So the key steps in this is consider how sustainability issues might trigger material financial effects on the organization across its value chain. create a ranked list of material financial risks and opportunities based upon likelihood and magnitude, quantify the risks and opportunities, and assess the actual potential impacts on how they might evolve over time. This is a difficult exercise. As Gabriel mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations don't understand necessarily their business model. And effectively, this is about potentially transforming the organization. You know, we often call CSRD the tail that wags the dog. You know, this is about actually implementing major transformation and actually delivering on the climate targets of an organization to address the material issues. Its reporting is a means to an end, but it's actually what you can do to deliver and address these particular risks. Francisco, what sort of risks do you see for an organization in trying to address this aspect, this step, assessing the financial perspective?
The risks for the organization doing this?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I would say it's not an easy part at all, because contrary to the sustainability topic, so the impact assessment that we've seen, the law does prescribe, and as a lawyer, I'm always trying to look for rules in the ESRS. And as we know, the ESRS, often the legislator, the EU legislator, decided to give room for the companies to define a way to do this. But then it gave major principles and major concepts on how to do this. So on one hand, we do have in the law principles and a way of how to do the double materiality, as we're seeing here in the slides. But on the other hand, the company does have room to adapt to its own methodologies. And we've seen this when we talked about risks, because it's often, and talking about thresholds in a bit, it's often very useful in practice to the company to adopt thresholds that are already in place in the company for other kinds of topics of assessment. You see what I'm trying to say? So it's if you have a risk taxonomy, for example, in your company, and you have a threshold of 1 to 10, perhaps it's easier for you to adopt the threshold of 1 to 10 instead of adopting a threshold of 1 to 5. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so I would say that one of the risks in the financial perspective is that the company tries to do this without listening to itself and without listening to its already existing standards. Because, as I said a bit ago, the law does provide for some concepts and for some criteria that ought to be assessed when it comes to financial perspective. But in my opinion, the law is not as clear in financial perspective materiality assessments as it is with the impact assessment. I don't know if you agree with me, if you know what I'm trying to say.
I do agree, yeah.
So the risk is that one, is that you try to multiplicate languages instead of finding a cohesive internal language that works for you. I would say this.
Yeah. Gabriel, as a experience, I mean, you're chairing a number of companies, and a lot of this is quite difficult to do. And we're looking at topics that the organization may not understand whether there's an impact, for example, biodiversity or some of the carbon issues. Do you need experts to help you with this, or can an organization get through this on their own?
I think in my experience, just the scope of this is so broad. You're asking companies to now consider things, for instance, such as biodiversity, such as workers in their value chain, both upstream and downstream, and start thinking about, emissions, scope 3 emissions, for instance, whether to get their heads around scope 1. So I think that companies could benefit from assistance, and in fairness to Enterprise Ireland and others, local enterprise offices for the smaller companies, there is assistance available. So I would strongly recommend, it's very important, and I think go back to what Nick said and a little bit what Martin has said as well. Where I come from on this is, and I think to answer the question that you posed to Francisco, The big risk here is that people will get tied into the form of this rather than the substance. We should try and get, and there's a great opportunity to get strategic benefit from a DMA. There's great opportunity. It forces you to describe your business model. You need to align with your vision, your mission, and the values of the company. And actually, if you take a more strategic, higher level, it's a great opportunity for companies to reorganize themselves, reorient themselves, because while a lot of attention has gone on the risks around this, we shouldn't get away if there are opportunities arising. And Bord na Móna is a very good example. Today it doesn't harvest any peat, and it's actually more profitable and larger than it was back in 2008 and 2009. That's all on renewable energy. So for many of the people that are listening and looking at this webinar, they're probably thinking about doing this for the first time. It's probably been driven by customers, maybe. Maybe there are some large companies that are already up and running. I think, as you said, they should focus on the impacts and the risks and opportunities, but on their business model. They need to look at, well, describe what is the business model and what are the impacts on the various different parts of that business model. It has to be aligned with the vision and values. Otherwise, you're doing this for compliance purposes, and you're not, that's going to be more onerous. If you're doing it because you want to do it and you see the opportunity for your business in doing, then it's going to be a much. So look at your double materiality as an asset, if you like, and not a cost.
Thank you, Gabriel. The last step in the process is to validate the results. I mean, it's really important that you conduct an executive team and board review. This is a strategic initiative, as Gabriel mentioned, and you really need to get them to buy into, understand, support, develop, provide additional context to this, because the materiality assessment, while it's done from a stakeholder perspective, it's also done from a strategic and an organization perspective. And materiality really is determined for an organization based on its sustainability, its mission, its vision. We typically create a double materiality matrix, which basically shows the intersection between the organization's requirements and the stakeholder needs. As we said earlier, it's important to document the methodology. The auditors will want it, probably want it even before you start the double materiality assessment. You need to explain the broader perspective of the assessment findings as well. So it's context. You need to give the larger picture of this and how it relates to the company's sustainability journey and what's going to be prioritized. You need to look at the risk mitigation steps. There's probably a stakeholder communication plan in terms of how you're going to act on it, both internally and externally. And then you need to integrate double materiality results into your annual reporting reports and strategy. And there's probably a process of continuous improvement, because you don't just do a continuous improvement process once. We recommend that you actually visit it on an annual basis. Here's just an example of, when we look at it and we illustrate sometimes how double materiality works. It's useful to actually have a scale which shows both the financial materiality and the impact materiality. This is an example of a double materiality matrix which was developed by H&M, the big Scandinavian retailer, and you can see, the issues for them are, are water, chemicals, and the economic performance of the business, and then some tips from a double materiality assessment. It's really important that you there's transparency, that there's accountability, compliance, and consistency in terms of what you do. So recording every decision is quite critical. You need to provide equal importance for financial and impact materiality. And this is where the independent evaluation from the auditors is really quite important. This is where having your materiality threshold is critical. And you also need to understand the interconnected relationship between the risks and their interdependencies. They need to be taken into account. And typically the assessment begins with the impact perspective, and sustainability impacts may translate into financial effects over time. We don't know them straight off. You need to take into account external factors. So that's really quite important. how external sustainability matters affects the organization. And you also need to propose the necessary disclosures according to the report standards. In terms of the level of detail, you need to consider the granularity. So the information should be detailed enough to reflect the variations between countries or locations or business locations or assets or production or differences within the businesses. The level of detail reporting should also align with the breakdown used in the company's materiality analysis. And reporting may extend to subsidiary level as necessary. And you need to also ensure that aggregating data across different levels or locations doesn't obscure crucial details needed for accurate interpretation. So there could be a huge issue in one location, which is basically disappears when you aggregate it, but that needs to get through. And you also need to ensure that you actually have sector-specific information, even though we don't have sector-specific guidelines. From a challenges perspective, these are the sort of things that organizations typically say to us when they're actually undertaking double materiality assessments. Francisco, what sort of challenges do you see when people are undertaking this process?
Oof, there are many challenges. I'm going to tell you one that I think it's a challenge and one opportunity, also coming from a legal perspective, which is, I think that if companies are aware that when they're doing this process, they are also preparing for other type of compliance and for other type of alignment with other EU legislation, that might be an ease. And I want to tell you, the challenge is sometimes people working in these sustainability topics are focused in the tree and they are not seeing the forest. So what I'm trying to say is, please be reminded if you are doing a double materiality analysis, that is extremely relevant and it's half the way of the work done. If you're trying to prepare for the CSRD, for example, for the due diligence legislation. And do be aware that if you are doing a double materiality analysis, it's probably very useful when it comes to the EU taxonomy minimal safeguards. You see what I mean? So I will give my challenge and my opportunity as please be reminded that this is all intersected and it's all going to work as a machine. And do keep in mind to see the forest of the trees when it comes to a regulatory process.
Thank you. Yeah, we're coming to the end of the webinar now, and what I will say is that the paper that accompanies this goes into the topics we discussed in a lot more detail. It gives lots of tips, gives recommendations as well. So we'd encourage you to request that document, or indeed listen to the recorded webinar. Now we have a number of questions which I'm just going to throw out to the panelists. The first one is, in terms of 5 steps of carrying out a double materiality assessment, could you speak to which teams within a company generally are best to carry out the steps 1 to 4, e.g. procurement, HR, finance, etc.? Anyone like to take that answer? Answer it?
I can go if you want to.
Yeah, thank you.
Listen, that's a great question, and it obviously it depends on a company itself. But keep in mind there needs to be an owner of the entire process overseeing this. I would strongly recommend it to do so. And for different IROs, and this is the key, I think for different topics of sustainability, and remember when Ray explained to you what an IRO is, different departments within the company are going to be called. For example, I'm a human rights specialist. So of course, I was called to give input for more of the social IROs. So when we were talking about human rights, human trafficking, child labor, all of these issues in the social ESRSs, I was called to give input. But I was not called to give input when it came to water. You see what I mean? So what I'm trying to say is, if you ask me which departments are going to be called in the different stages of the process, First of all, keep in mind that different departments may be called for different types of sustainability topics. So you don't have to be like the same sustainability topic is going to be asked to all the same departments. I would say so. And of course, for the financial part of the assessment, I think there are key departments that are going to be called either way. And of course, sustainability departments, legal departments, HR departments when it comes to the own workforce are going to be crucial. Well, it really does depend, but I hope I did give some clarity on the topic.
Yeah, but what I would say is this is not a finance project. Finance may coordinate it, or sustainability may coordinate it, but it impacts right across the business. We've recently done a DMA to illustrate the implications for the organization. And the organization was quite frankly surprised when you actually went through all the functions. Like HR was saying, I didn't realize we had to change job descriptions or performance metrics. I didn't realize we had to hire different people. I didn't realize we had to retrain people. And as you went through all the functions of the organization, there was a lot of surprise there. This is very, very wide. And Francisco, I think you're absolutely right. You need specific experts within the organization to answer specific areas of expertise. So the next question we have is, what is the general best practice for governance of this exercise? Some particular business functions owning and leading it, or some cross-collaboration style approach? Martin or Gabriel?
Yeah, well, this is somewhat related to the previous question.
Yeah.
And I guess, look, where I come from on this, and it depends on what type of organization you are. Are you a micro business, a small business, a medium business, or a large business? So that would be my first starting point. If you're a micro business, well, then you've got a certain scale. If you're a most large companies now at this stage, they have a sustainability director or manager. It actually cascades up to the board. It's a board responsibility. So I think that's first thing. Second point, Ray, as you said, this transcends all elements of the organization. You cannot be doing this and getting the substance out of this rather than just the compliance bit, because it has impacts on every aspect of the business, on your operations, on your procurement policies, on your supply chain, your key partners, all your activities, where you do your activities and how you do them, and what are the risks on different sites. So if you're a small company, the likelihood, with most companies, this is going to be audited. And the likelihood is that it's going to be audited by your financial auditors, who themselves are gearing up in terms of their knowledge and expertise to enable them conduct audits. So I think the larger organizations have put in enormous efforts into investing in structures to enable this. The smaller companies, depending on size, generally speaking, you're going to involve a number of people. If you're a medium-sized company, you're certainly going to have the operations people. You're going to have a team approach. Likely, obviously, the finance function will have an oversight, because in some cases there's going to be costs involved in this, and generally speaking, they're going to be the ones interacting with the external auditors when it comes to auditing these.
Thank you very much. The last question we had here is, what's the specific Irish legislation relating to this? Well, it's the statutory instrument which the government have put in place to enact CSRD, and this also impacts the Companies Act 2014, and it introduces new sections to the Act. So that's what you need to refer to. I'd like to thank everybody for their contribution, and I'll hand over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Ray. And look, thanks so much to all the panel today for taking part. Ray, for you putting it all together, but also thanks to Nick and to Gabriel, to Martin and to Francesco as well. I think you shared some really valuable insights there for all our attendees. We'll share the slides, the recording, and we'll also share the guide you mentioned there as well, Ray, with attendees. And if anyone is watching back the webinar afterwards, feel free to reach out to green@enterprise-ireland.com, which is our green inbox, and we'll be able to share it there. So look, I know we've gone a little bit over time, but I think everybody found it very useful. There's a lot of questions coming in there at the end, and some thanks as well. So look, we won't delay any further, but look, just do reach out to your development advisor or the green inbox if you've any queries in